The French plan was to create at Dien Bien Phu, deep in hostile territory, a fortified base which would threaten the enemy's supply lines to Laos. Just as important, the fort might act as bait, luring the Viet Minh to attack with their best troops. The base could be supplied from Laos overland, and it could also be reinforced by air. French commander Colonel Christian de Castries was completely confident. He was certain that aircraft could supply all the base's needs. Only enemy artillery posed any real danger. Some Viet Minh guns had begun to fire on the base, but the French were sure that only a handful could have been deployed in such difficult hilly terrain. As for Viet Minh supplies and reinforcements, French air power would make sure they never reached Dien Bien Phu. Even though up to 100 French planes attacked Viet Minh supply routes every day, their efforts were having little effect. Too often, aircraft were grounded by the weather, and in any case, the Viet Minh were masters of camouflage and deployed huge numbers of anti-aircraft guns. In a massive effort over several months, General Nguyen Giap, the Viet Minh commander, used 50,000 support troops to deploy more than 200 artillery pieces and anti-aircraft guns and a vast supply of ammunition around Dien Bien Phu. It was one of the most extraordinary feats of logistics in military history. The base at Dien Bien Phu had been sited on a flat valley floor. The airstrip and headquarters were the focus for the main battle position. A complex of 5 strongholds, codenamed Françoise, Huguette, Claudine, Eliane, Dominique. To break up attacks, strongpoints Anne-Marie, Gabrielle, Béatrice, and Isabelle had been created on a series of low hills. The base was manned by 9 infantry battalions and 2 crack parachute battalions. For support, there were artillery and mortars, light tanks, and fighter bombers. By early March 1954, 49,000 Viet Minh had deployed around Dien Bien Phu. 3 infantry divisions and 2 independent regiments were supported by the field guns of the 351st Heavy Division on the hills to the east, and by heavy mortars on all sides. Weeks went on. Viet Minh artillery fire caused more and more casualties amongst the French at Dien Bien Phu. Any day now, the French knew, they would face an all-out enemy attack. It came on March 13, 1954. The loss of their northern outposts cost the French 1,500 men. The Viet Minh had suffered much worse, nearly 7,000 killed and wounded, but they had proved that the French defenses could be overcome. They had also closed down the base's main airfield for good. The French would now have to depend on parachute drops for supply and reinforcement. In the end, shocking Viet Minh casualties forced General Giap to pause. Meanwhile, the French situation was getting desperate. Ammunition and food was short, and 3,000 wounded were trapped inside the base in appalling conditions. Although the outpost Isabelle was still in French hands, it was by now cut off from the central stronghold at Dien Bien Phu. Besieged by the Viet Minh 304th Division, Isabelle was under heavy artillery fire. Incredibly, although attacked time and time again, the post would hold out until the very end of the battle. In the central sector, Strongpoint Françoise had been abandoned, and the Viet Minh had captured Dominique along with part of Elian and Huguette. However, there were two new strongpoints, Sparrowhawk and Juno. Meanwhile, the Viet Minh had adopted new tactics in an attempt to reduce their terrible casualties. Secretly, they had dug more than 50 miles of trenches, creeping right up to the French perimeter. The final Viet Minh assault came on the night of May 1st, 1954. After a massive barrage, the Viet Minh infantry hit the remaining bunkers of Huguette and Elian. In spite of fierce French resistance, positions fell one by one until, on the evening of the sixth day, a huge mine demolished part of Elian and its last bunkers were overrun. At 5:30 p.m. on May 7, 1954, Vietnamese forces occupied the French command post, and the French commander ordered his troops to cease fire. It was 55 days to the minute since the battle had begun. At Dien Bien Phu, 3,000 French troops had been killed and 8,000 wounded. The Viet Minh had suffered much worse, with more than 8,000 dead and 12,000 wounded. But for them, the outcome had still been a triumph. On the eve of an international conference on Indochina, they had shattered France's resolve to carry on the war. The Viet Minh expected that the negotiations at Geneva would open the way for full Vietnamese independence and a major role for them in running the new country. Behind closed doors, Chinese Prime Minister Zhou Enlai struck a deal with the French and forced Ho Chi Minh to agree that the country be divided into two zones. There was to be a ceasefire, but there would be no immediate decision about who was to control Vietnam until elections settled the future. Ho was adored by millions of Vietnamese, North and South, as the man who'd driven out the French. But he had only won half a victory. South Vietnam, backed by the United States, refused to hold the elections that had been agreed at Geneva, the elections Ho had counted on, in which the U.S. knew he would win, to reunify the country. In January 1959, with Ho Chi Minh's blessing, the North Vietnamese Communist Party voted to support armed revolution in South Vietnam.